Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So this is our 10th session, and inshallah we carry on with the discussion of Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar. May Allah bless the Imam. As I said, what we did was we started off with a passage yesterday, a long passage regarding his attributes, and we were commenting on that passage. So inshallah today we continue with that discussion. So and then we're going to go into some additional discussions today. So let us start off with he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is obviously one without partner. So he was, is, and will be forever possessed of his names and his essential and active attributes. Now, some of you may be thinking, what's the difference between a name and an attribute, right? A name and an attribute. I think it's quite simple. The difference is that the name, for example, the name is what indicates the essence along with the attribute. So the name is a more wholesome term that includes the attribute. So for example, you say to someone, you say about somebody that he is powerful. So he is powerful because he's got power. Power is the attribute. Powerful is what characterizes the individual, the possessor of the power, in a more wholesome way, that he is the powerful one because he's got power. Now, if you said power, that's just the attribute, that's not a name. I mean, of course, it's the name of the attribute, but it's not a name, right? It's the power is the attribute itself. So attribute refers to the attribute itself, whereas name refers to the possessor of the attribute along with the attribute. So, for example, when you say powerful or all-knowing, then you include the attributes of power and knowledge within that. So an attribute or sifa, on the other hand, is that which just indicates the quality itself that is associated with the possessor or the essence. So like power and knowledge itself. A name is what an entity is called or identified by, and an attribute is the quality or characteristic it possesses. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says regarding names, the most beautiful names belong to Allah. So call on to him by them. Chapter 7 verse 180. And then to Allah applies the loftiest attributes, chapter 16 verse 60. So that gives you a slight the difference between a name and an attribute, and inshallah we'll be discussing these So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. What Imam Abu Hanifa is saying here with what we just read is that none of his names are attributed or attributes originated later for him. Let's understand now the difference between the essential and active attributes as he has separated them. Any attribute whose opposite can be attributed to Allah Most High is an active attribute, right? For example, Allah being the creator. The opposite of making and creating is giving death. So that's an active attribute. If its attribute cannot be attributed to, if its opposite can't be attributed to Allah Most High, then that's considered an essential attribute. For example, life. Opposite of that is death. You can't attribute that to Allah. Glory. Opposite of that is being lowly. That can't be attributed to Allah. Likewise, knowledge. Opposite of that is ignorance. Right? Being able to will something and do something. Well, the opposite of that is the opposite of that is not being able to will something. That's obviously a problem. So that's the difference between them. So then he says, Imam Abu Hanifa says, as for his essential attributes, they are life. Right? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's life is pre-eternal, is there from pre-eternity. Allah has power. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power over all things, with his power, which was an eternal attribute. It just didn't appear after there was something that he could exercise his power on. Right? Knowledge. Allah is aware of all things which are existent. He is aware of the apparent. He is aware of the hidden through his knowledge, which is an eternal attribute. Now, something about the knowledge, I just want to clarify. Knowledge is an essential attribute, right? What is exactly is knowledge? Knowledge is an attribute that uncovers and exposes anything that could be known, right? Anything that could be known. The knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously encompasses everything. Nothing such as an atom from the heavens and the earth remain outside his knowledge. He knows the apparent, he knows the hidden, the parts, the wholes, the existent. He knows the non-existent. He knows how it would be if it would be existent. He knows the possible, He knows the impossible. He knows everything. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, chapter 67 verse 14, does He not know who created? Meaning He's the creator, does He not know? And He is the knower of the subtleties, and He is the aware. He also says, with Him are the keys of the unseen, the treasures that none knows but Him. He knows whatever there is on the earth and in the sea. Not a leaf falls here, but with His knowledge. There is not a grain, ما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة, not a grain in the darkness or depths of the earth, nor anything fresh or dry, green or withered, but it's inscribed in a record clear. Chapter 6 verse 59. Then after that He discusses the speech. Allah Most High, and I think I've explained the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how the Quran is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His divine archetype of His speech and His eternal speech. However, the most point that the biggest point we need to understand here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's speech is unlike creation speech. And as I discussed, speech is usually something that is in our minds. We speak, that's the source of our speech, and then we articulate it. The other thing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah's speech is unlike the speech of creation, because creation has to speak with organs, apparatus, it needs the tongue, the lips, etc., and letters and sounds and so on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's eternal speech is without any of that, right? That's what you call the kalam nafsi. Then what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created and sent down to creation in the form of the Torah, the Zabur, the Injil, the Quran, those are considered His kalam lafzi, right? Those are considered to be His kalam lafzi, which basically means His created, articulated speech that reflects, it's still divine, it is still a miracle, and it is very special, but that is what reflects His kalam nafsi. Now, while this difference exists, and this is the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they made that very, very clear. Imam Ahmad and the Athari, the pure Hanbalis, they did not like to make this distinction, right? That's the thing. They did not like to make this distinction. They basically said the Quran is the speech of Allah and it is uncreated. That's it. They didn't want to go into detail, and anybody who went into the detail, they did not like that. That doesn't mean that they necessarily denied it completely, or they thought that a copy of the Quran, like a physical of the copy of the Quran, is pre-eternal. There were some that went to an extreme to say that though later, but the proper Hanbalis, they didn't go to that extreme. They just didn't want to delve into that and separate those two out. That's another point of slight difference of opinion. However, the deviant ones, they went beyond that, and they said that that which is in between the two covers, of a volume of the Quran, a copy of the Quran, that would be all pre-eternal. I mean, those were clearly created. I mean, how could they be pre-eternal? So they didn't like to go into that distinction. The Ash'aris and Maturidis said, look, we have to make that clear so that people don't start getting the wrong idea. So that's why they said that whatever one speaks, and Imam Abu Hanifa, I'll leave him to discuss it later when he does. So I'll carry on with the rest of his discussion today, right? So well, actually, I mean, he will discuss it later. We'll just leave it inshallah for then. Another point to understand here is that many of the slight difference between Ash'aris and Maturidis, the Ash'aris, Imam Qunawi, for example, states in his Sharh al-Umdah, what about the word kun? Many of the Ash'aris, they will consider that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to create something, He uses the word kun, which means be, and then it becomes. So kun is actually His speech, which means that His speech is needed to bring something into being. The Maturidis, they say, no, that's not necessarily, and that's not necessary at all, right? That's not necessary at all. So I'll just read you a bit of a discussion on this from Qunawi in his Sharh al-Umdah. He says, as for the word kun, which is the imperative be, the majority of the Sunnah wal Jama'ah do not consider it necessary to bring things into being. Rather, they consider their existence depending upon His Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ijad, or originating, and taqween, or bringing something into being, and that these are his eternal attributes. This is the opinion of the Maturidis, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, and a majority of the Quranic exegetes as well. However, Imam Ash'ari and those who follow him, they consider the existence of things to be dependent upon his attribute of eternal speech, the word kun being the indicator of that speech, as mentioned in his Sharh al-Ta'wilat, right? There's a third opinion on the matter, is that some Maturidi scholars like Fakhrul Islam al-Bazdawi in his Usul, who said that creation was from the word kun and from Allah's attribute of ijad, and that it is invalid to deem kun a metaphorical expression for taqween. So he had a slightly different view. Now, so why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mention, for example, in when he has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned more than one place, in chapter 3 verse 47, when Allah has decreed something, he says to it only be, and it is. So in one of the tafsirs he mentions that he, Most High, did not intend by this that he addresses it with the word kun and it comes into being, because if that were to consider, if we were to consider this a real address, it would either be to something non-existent that comes into existence by it, or it is an address to the existent after it comes into existence. It cannot be the former, since the non-existent is not yet an entity, or how can it be addressed? This is a bit of an argument against why, against the fact that it has to be said, right? It also cannot be the latter, since it is already existent. So how does he order it to be when it already is? So then he concludes, which is the most important point here, rather it is merely to express that when he wills something to be, it is. So he's saying that, when Allah does mention in the Quran that whenever he wants something to happen, he just has to say it be, and it is just to emphasize the speed and the lack of effort required by Allah to put his will into action and to exemplify his greatness and ability. It is in the same way that Allah Most High resurrects those who are in their graves with his power, while the blowing of the horn is simply an apparent cause of that occurrence, to express his might. There are many logical proofs that creation stems from ijad, right? So that's just a little slight point on the side, okay? That's just a little side point on the side. Allah doesn't need to use the word kun. Rather, it is enough for him just to will it to happen, and it will happen. The next thing that Imam Abu Hanifa says is hearing. So I think I've discussed that before. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears all sounds and words through his pre-eternal hearing, which is his eternal attribute. Likewise, seeing, same things. Allah Most High sees all forms, all colors with his pre-eternal sight, which is his attribute, right? Then he discusses willing. For Allah Most High has willed with his pre-eternal will that which is and that which is to be. So just to give you an explanation of what exactly will is, right? Will is, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power. He has knowledge. Now, logically speaking, if you want to put something into action and make it happen well and do good with it, you need knowledge. So a person can have knowledge and a person can have power, right? However, sometimes people are restricted and incapacitated from using their power because of some kind of obstacle or hindrance or blockage. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has none of that. He also has will, and will means that he can just decide what he wants to do. He can decide that he wants something to come into being, or that he doesn't want something to come into being. So you can say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is living, he has power, he has knowledge. According to that knowledge, he can use his power and he can will things to come into being, right? So now you get an understanding of will is. So the way Maghni Sawi explains will is, Allah Most High has willed with his pre-eternal will that which is and that which is to be. Nothing in the world or the next, whether small or large, meager or great, good or bad, beneficial or detrimental, nor any success or ruin, or increase or decrease occurs but through his will and desire. Whatever Allah desires is, and what he does not is not. Allah does all that he wills, and there is no one to repulse his will and desire, no one to defer his command. And among some of his other essential attributes are oneness, ahadiyya. So I've mentioned the absolute fundamental ones, but there's others. Like ahadiyya, oneness, is an essential attribute. Sovereignty, samadiyya. Azama, exaltedness. He can't have the opposite of any of these, can he? All right? Grandeur, grandeur, that's kibriya, and others. These are all his essential attributes. Now, if we move on to the next section. Imam Abu Hanifa mentions here that there are 7 essential attributes, right? Just want to clarify some others because these are not exhaustive. These are just the main ones and that are agreed upon, and everybody kind of highlights them because they are the fundamental ones. Others include ahadiyya fi dhat, right? Oneness in essence. Ahadiyya fi sifa, or fi sifat. Oneness in attributes, that there's nothing else like him in terms of his attributes either. And then another one is eternal independence from any possible being. That Allah is always going to be independent. Now that you can't have the opposite of that, that he be dependent. So that shows that that is also an essential attribute. Greatness and azama, exaltedness and kibriya. In explaining the difference between azama and kibriya, what exactly is the difference between azama and kibriya? Exaltedness and greatness, or greatness and exaltedness. Imam Ghazali says that one must believe in the difference between these two because Allah has mentioned them separately, even though the difference might be subtle. Since Allah mentions each of them in a different context and has said in a hadith Qudsi, greatness, azama, is my upper garment and exaltedness or kibriya is my lower garment. Now, if Allah is separating between the two, there must be a difference. We might not be able to understand that subtlety of difference because they both refer to greatness. But there must be a difference, and everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about himself must mean something unique, however subtle the difference might be, right? So, La ilaha illallah. Now, another question that could come up here, that in the Arabic he uses the word qadim and mawjood and wajib, the necessarily existent. Mawjood means the present one. Qadim means pre-eternal. These aren't, a lot of these words don't necessarily always come in the sacred text and so on. So how can we use them? The answer to that is very simple, that throughout the ages there's become a consensus, an ijma', right? Which obviously constitutes a legal evidence for us that these things can be used, right? These things can be used and they are absolutely appropriate for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right, then he says, as for his active attributes, so he moves on to his active attributes. Now, his active attributes that we read above, and I'll tell you some more about them, they a lot of them can actually come under the one collective attribute, that's like a collective term for them, is called takween, right? Takween. Takween means to bring something into being. So essentially all the active attributes, for example, creating, takhliq, right? That is an aspect of takween, right? So that's takween is kind of an overarching term that is used. Now there's a difference of opinion here between the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. The Maturidis say that takween is an essential attribute, is one of the fundamental attributes, and it is pre-eternal, right? So they say it is eternal, whereas just as knowledge is, for example, the Ash'aris, though, they say that this is actually not this is actually a created attribute. It's actually not an essential, it's not an eternal attribute. The Ash'aris, they hold that takween is originated, so they don't call it pre-eternal. They reduce takween from being a separate attribute to just being an attribute of the power, the qudra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, the 7 essential attributes we discussed above. So power was one of them. So they say that when power is put into action, then it's called takween. So it's actually just an association, an attribute of power, and it has a particular effect. Maturidis say, no, this is a separate, independent attribute, because power is the capacity, is an attribute that refers to the capacity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do something, whereas when Allah does something as an active attribute, then that comes from taqween, so it is sufficient, it is independent, it is separate from qudra, not just that it's not an association of qudra, meaning it's not just something that's that is like a subordinate of qudra. They're both on equal terms, right? So that's the kind of difference between them. So they say that all associations of any of the attributes, right, of the attribute of qudra rather, is going to be called taqween. So the Maturidis say no, that's not what it is. And I don't want to go into the debate between them in more detail about each one of them, their arguments and so on. Now, what are the active attributes? He says they are creating, sustaining, bringing into being, originating, making, and others. Now, as you can see, all of these, the Ash'aris would say, they come from the attribute of power. We're saying that, yes, Allah has the capability to do all of these things, but when He does these things, that's done through a separate attribute of taqween, which, works in tandem with, and it's a pre-eternal attribute which works in tandem with the qudra. So there's more: giving life, ihya, causing death, causing growth, imbat, developing, inma, shaping, tasweer. All of these are considered to be the active attributes. As you can say, they're all doing something. Insha, bringing into being, sun, making. They're all... Now, if you look at, there's a few of them that seem to be the same. Takhliq, insha, and sunnah. Takhliq means creating, insha means bringing, originating, and sunnah means making. They all seem to have the same meaning, bringing something into being that was not existent. Right? Then you've got the word ibda', which means originating, means bringing into being something that was not existent and that is not based on the previous model. Whereas some of the others mean bringing into being something that was not existent, whether based on the previous model or not. So there are subtle differences between them. And then you've got tarzik, which means sustaining, which is bringing into being the sustenance of something and enabling them to benefit from that sustenance, right? Now, Imam Abu Hanifa sufficed by mentioning the above essential active attributes and not others, even though there are others, because these are the popular attributes. They're sufficient for believers to understand the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His attributes by. So it doesn't need to mention all of them here in an exhaustive list. And Imam Abu Hanifa says he was and is ever possessed of His names and attributes. That is, Allah Most High, with all of His attributes and names, is pre-eternally beginningless and eternally limitless. Then he says no name or attribute originated later for Him. Right? Why? Because if any attribute of Allah Most High were to have originated anew for Him, or to have ceased to exist after being existent, obviously then He would not have been complete. He would have been incomplete before it originated or after it ceased to exist. That's inconceivable. Therefore, it becomes clearly established that no attribute or name originated anew for Him, because whoever possesses knowledge in pre-eternity is the knower in pre-eternity of everything that is to happen, and time does not apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Time does not apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, what I want to mention here, something important, which is that in the Quran, if the Quran is the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then how come in the Quran we have the past tense, or we sent Nuh alayhi salam, we have the future tense that we will do this to people? Why are there tenses in the Quran of past, present and future when time doesn't apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So Mullah Ali al-Qari gives an understanding of this, which I think is useful for us. Allah is pre-eternal and everlasting, and there is no past, present and future with Allah, obviously, because time doesn't apply to Him, right? However, he says these terms. So if the Quran is the eternal speech of Allah, then why do we have past, present and future in the Quran? Now, the reason for that is that the eternal pre-eternal archetype speech does not have any of this, right? That doesn't have any of this because that is the eternal speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, the Quran that was revealed down to us in this special Arabic was composed of special Arabic and phrases of the highest eloquence. And that was sent down in a way that was relevant to us in terms of past, present, and future. So there is past, present, and future in that, right? But not in the pre-eternal speech of Allah, the divine archetype. That utilizes no words or sounds or syntax or grammar, right? As you know, similar to the language that we use does. So in the revealed speech, events are characterized by tense based on the connection with the time in which they were revealed, whether before or after the time the Quran was, after the event that was mentioned. That's why it mentions about Nuh alayhi salam that we sent, rather than we will send, for example, or anything else. So I think that's an important clarification to make. Then he says, he has forever been the all-knowing with his knowledge. Now this is like a roundup of his attributes, which we mentioned earlier. He has forever been the all-knowing with his knowledge. Knowledge was an attribute in pre-eternity. Powerful with his power, and power was an attribute in pre-eternity. The speaker with his speech, and speech was an attribute in pre-eternity. The creator with his creating, and creating was an attribute in pre-eternity. And likewise, he was the doer with his doing, while doing was an attribute in pre-eternity. So why does he say this? One of the reasons he says this is that this is a rebuttal of the opinion of the Mu'tazila, who asserted that the attributes of Allah are his essence itself. He didn't have separate attributes. So they would say, now listen carefully, they would say that Allah is the listener, but he doesn't have an attribute of listening. He's just a listener by his essence. Allah is the speaker, but he doesn't have speech. It's kind of a weird way that you can't even reconcile it in your mind. Because if you look linguistically speaking as well, that when you call somebody, when you call somebody loving, he must have love. When you say this is black, right? It must have blackness in it. Otherwise, how can you say something is black where there's no blackness in it, and say, oh, there's no blackness in it, but it's black? Doesn't make any sense. So it's anti-linguistic and it's anti-reality, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, for example, most of the time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses his names rather than the attribute himself. So he uses the name to convey the attribute. So he says Sami'un, Basirun, Qadirun, Qadirun, Muqtadirun, and so on, right? However, in some places, Allah has used the attribute itself without the name. For example, أَنزَلَهُ بِعِلْمِهِ. Allah has revealed it with his knowledge. How can you deny that? So the Mu'tazila says, and there's a reason why they mention that, the reason why they deny that Allah has no attributes, because they can't understand how attributes can exist. Because if you have an attribute that exists and then you believe that that attribute is pre-eternal, that means goes against the tawheed of Allah, that Allah is supposed to be one, but then you're saying that Allah's essence and attributes are separate. And if Allah is obviously pre-eternal himself, but if the attribute was also pre-eternal, as you Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah say, then that means you've got a multiplicity of eternal beings, and that goes against the concept of tawheed. We're saying, no, it doesn't go, because this is a whole, right? The attributes, the way we define them, is that neither are they separate from Allah, but neither are they Allah's essence themselves. We give that kind of a hypostatic definition of the attributes of Allah. Allah's attributes are neither Allah's essence itself, right? That means they're separate, but neither are they totally separate either. So what are they? That's all we can say. We can't say anything else. That's all we know. We can just tell you that neither are they Allah's essence, because if you said they were Allah's essence, that means that you're saying something is black without there being any black in it, right? That means you're denying the attribute. We can't do that, because Allah himself has mentioned his attributes like anzalahu bi'ilmi, but we also can't say that they're totally separate. Because if you say that, then that means you're giving something independent existence, and that's not right. That's the way that Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah managed to reconcile between it, by saying that Allah is with all of his attributes as one unique, wholesome oneness. The Mu'tazila weren't willing to go there. They said, no, there are no attributes. Okay, does that mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not a speaker, is not the creator. No, he is all of those things, but with this absurd understanding of, oh, there is no attribute, though he's just that himself. That is who he is. Whereas Imam Abu Hanifa wants to rebut them, and that's why he makes it very, 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 very clear that Allah has, that's why he differentiates between, and he mentions both. He says he was the speaker with his speech, and his speech was always an attribute in pre-eternity. The creator with his creating, so not just the creator without any creating, but a creator with his creating, while the creating was an attribute in pre-eternity. This is to respond to them, right? So that's why the Mu'tazila are called the Mu'attila, the cancellers, the negators of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We still don't call them kafir. The ulama, majority of the ulama have not considered them to be kafir, because ultimately they've agreed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has his beautiful names, which, for us include the attribute, but they just don't believe in the attribute itself as something separate, but that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the listener and the speaker and the living one, and so on and so forth. Right? Okay, so let's move on. Then he talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the doer and so on, and then I think the conclusion is his attributes in pre-eternity are neither originated nor created by another. Whoever says that they, meaning his essential and active attributes, are created or originated, that they came up later or they even waver, right? That is, they neither maintain the existence of the attributes or their non-existence. Like they're just like wishy-washy. Oh, I don't know if they existent, I don't know if they're not existent, that kind of a thing. Either due to obstinacy or ignorance, or the person is doubtful, right? Then he literally says is an unbeliever of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Iman means conviction. That means your heart must submit to something and accept it and adopt it. So whoever doesn't believe in them is ignorant of Allah Most High and his attributes. He's not gone far enough to understand that. Right? Now, Mullah Ali Al-Qari clarifies here that if somebody is in any doubt about any of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or his names, or anything for that matter, which are necessary to believe in the way Allah intends them to be, then one must actively seek to find out sufficient details and to alleviate any doubt and establish faith firmly in their heart. Go and seek out. Right, and this is what we're doing here in this course, right? A person is responsible for knowing the essence of Allah, that Allah has an essence. Allah is essence and all of his attributes, because that is who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. However, the attributes of which ignorance and doubt leads one to unbelief. So you see, we said above that these are the main attributes, and then you have others which they've not mentioned, because these ones are something that are fundamental, and if you deny any of these or don't know, you won't know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fully, whereas the other ones, they're corollaries of this, or they're associated to this, and so he says that the attributes of which ignorance and doubt leads to one to unbelief are the aforementioned well-known attributes of life, power, knowledge, speech, hearing, sight, will, and creation and sustaining. Right? You can't be ignorant of these things because these are so essential and they're so obvious and evident. So to finish off this discussion and summarize it for today, what we discussed today was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his beautiful attributes, active and essential attributes. We clarified that the essential attributes were those that the opposite of that cannot be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whereas the active attributes, it's like giving life. So that means he can give death, sustaining somebody, he doesn't have to sustain everybody, another person, and so on and so forth. The important discussion about the attributes is that the attributes are something separate to the essence, when you break it down, right? Allah, when you say the word Allah, that refers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his essence and all of his attributes. Now the attributes, there's multiple attributes. There's probably infinite number of attributes. However, the ulama have looked through and said, what are the most essential attributes for somebody to genuinely recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? They've reduced it down to these 7 or 8 attributes, right? In terms of the essential attributes. There are a lot of others though, right, that relate to them. But these are the most essential ones, right? They provide the fundamental ones. Now, what happens is that we need to understand the attributes. As I told you, the Mu'tazila, they denied the attributes because they said that if you believe in an attribute, then Allah must have possessed them from pre-eternity, could not have come up later. because Allah is pre-eternal, everlasting, and he doesn't develop in any way, or anything doesn't get added to him in any way. So they just said they can't be pre-eternal attributes. Why? Because they have this really extreme concept of Tawheed, overly, how can Tawheed be extreme? Their Tawheed is so extreme that Allah is so one and so unique that you can't even see him. That's why they denied what the hadith are very, very, very clear about, that we will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. And likewise, the Quran mentions وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ. Nadhira, that they are gazing at their Lord. They misinterpret that as they will be waiting for their Lord, because they completely deny that. They have this extreme form of Tawheed. So that's why they said Allah can't have attributes, but because he's used these names which include the attributes, then he is a listener and a speaker and a powerful and a willing one and so on, but without that. So they're literally saying that like this is red without redness in it. This is white without whiteness in it. It's kind of this crazy concept. They did that to escape what they thought would be a multiplicity of eternal beings. We said it's not a multiplicity of eternal beings, because the attributes, while they are in a sense different from his that neither are they Allah himself, but neither are they totally separate either. They have this hypostatic essence, if you want to use that term, where they are one with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that sense. So inshallah that's clear. Inshallah we'll move on to our next session, inshallah.